Okay, welcome to the first video of our qualitative research session. So the plan for our session on March 25th, now that we've had to move online, is that I've created 3 video lectures that I'd like you to watch before we meet. So those videos include this current introduction, a short video about qualitative research within the field of health policy, and then another video about ensuring quality in qualitative research. The other thing I'd like you to do, which you received instructions by email from Sherry, is to locate and read a long-form news article. Can be about any sort of health or policy problem that's not related to your thesis. When we meet on March 25th, we'll meet by Zoom and we'll discuss the content in the videos. I've designed a little bit of an exercise to do, and there'll be lots of chance to ask questions. So I'm going to review some of the information that we talked about in October because I think it's really important scaffolding for you to understand the different aspects of a qualitative research project in preparation for your comprehensive exams, but also in preparation for any qualitative research that you might be conducting or might be reading. I've tried to construct this video so that you can pause and you can sort of check your own understanding before I proceed. So feel free to do that or just watch it through. Okay, so the essential objective or the question of this whole video is what are the components or the considerations that you have to think of every time you design a qualitative research project. So what are the things that stay consistent no matter what your research question or your topic or your methodology or the purpose for which you're doing the research, whatever those things are, what stays consistent across all projects. So this is a good time to stop the video and jot down some notes if you want to test your understanding. So the first thing is philosophical assumptions. We really need to understand what we think about what exists in the world, what we can know about it, and how we know about it. And you might remember these words, epistemology, ontology, methodology, as referring to those 3 questions. What exists, what can we know about it, and how do we know that? So every qualitative research project, and frankly, every research project has some of these philosophical assumptions, but in qualitative research, it's important to make these explicit and to really think about how they influence the other decisions in the research. Another essential element is the methodology. So these methodologies they're packages of guidance about how to do qualitative research, and they were developed in particular disciplines within particular philosophical paradigms. So they're sort of informed by these bodies of knowledge, but then they tell you how you might collect data, some strategies for analyzing that data, and they usually have specific criteria for ensuring quality. So there's sort of like an off-the-shelf built-in package about how you might do qualitative research. Super important. The other element is the research question. So your research question is the guiding question for your entire inquiry. It should be congruent with the methodology. Each methodology has a particular focus of inquiry, so you want to make sure that the methodology you pick is appropriate for your research question. Typically, these 2 elements, the methodology and the research question, are chosen iteratively. They each kind of inform the other one. The research question might shift over the course of your inquiry. This is typical because when we collect data and analyze it iteratively, this often leads to a more refined understanding of the phenomenon or a more refined understanding of exactly what we're looking at. Totally normal, acceptable in most methodologies. So the other thing you're going to need is a data collection and analysis plan, and this needs to be congruent with your methodology. So here, I think it would be useful to think of your methodology as a menu. It tells you what's available, but there's still lots of choices that you have to make depending on the circumstances of your project. You've got to choose what you're going to order, and you also need to choose what modifications you might ask for that order. So to continue this menu metaphor, if you were dining at a Greek restaurant, you might have a variety of different choices, and you maybe pick a particular plate, And then maybe you want to substitute rice for potatoes. But you can ask them to like bring you some spaghetti or something on the side, right? There are some things that are available and some modifications are possible. There's some ways of getting creative, of asking to accommodate your diet modifications or whatever, the feasibility constraints of your research. But then there are some things which are completely out of reach because they're just not on that menu. They're not part of what that methodology thinks is acceptable for collecting data. So when you're designing your research project, your methodology, it's going to describe a variety of ways that you might collect data, but it's up to you to pick and choose the data collection methods that best fit your research question and your suppositions about what will yield the richest data. You'll also have to consider what's feasible here too, and that's normal and it's totally fine. And we all appreciate in research that there's often an ideal thing that's just not possible, and we need to make a design that's feasible, but also which will yield rich data. Sampling and recruitment, I guess it's kind of like a subcategory under data collection and analysis, but this is really about thinking in terms of how you're going to locate the data that you want to collect. So often when we talk about sampling and recruitment, we're talking about people. What kind of people do we want to talk to or do we want to observe? How are we going to identify them and how are we going to invite them to participate? And key to qualitative research, how will the strategy change as the project progresses and analysis proceeds? So very typically in qualitative research, there's a phase at which you refine the type of person that you are looking to recruit in order to fill gaps in your existing data set, to pursue different elements that you've discovered are particularly interesting. The phrase sampling and recruitment also works for projects where the data doesn't come from people. So we might sample documents, for instance. If you're doing a case study, you're sampling the case, the group or the case rather than the particular individuals. In all cases, sampling is about choosing rich and relevant data. And so it's a very important thing to consider. And another common element is considering the role of the researcher. So here you really want to lean on your methodology first for guidance, because how different methodologies think of the role of the researcher really varies, and it's closely linked to the philosophical assumptions and the methodological tradition. So sometimes in some methodologies, the researcher is really seen as the research instrument, and there are very clear guidelines about how to consider knowledge and the decision points that come to the researcher. And specific instructions about how you might examine your own influence as a researcher, how you might make that transparent to the readers of your research. In other qualitative methodologies, they take maybe a more post-positivist or a more descriptive approach, and their approach is to ask the researcher to bracket out their influence on the work. So it's important to understand what your methodology thinks of this. So here's a little template for the different elements that you might want to consider when you're designing or describing a qualitative research project. I tend to use these as headings when I'm writing the methods section of a paper. Depending on the journal I'm submitting to, sometimes the philosophical assumptions are more implicit than explicit. Journals which are more familiar with qualitative research will often ask you to name those explicitly, but in a more clinical journal, it's a little bit of read between the lines to figure that out. It wouldn't necessarily be its own heading. But these other elements are usually described very explicitly within a manuscript. And so it's something that I'd recommend that you think of, for instance, when your comprehensive exam comes around or when your thesis proposal, when you're designing a study for your thesis, make sure that you're addressing all of these different elements. And more importantly, thinking about how these different elements fit together. So they all kind of build on each other. They all, there's some interplay between each of these elements. And so when we think about these different elements working together, this is the beauty and also the complexity of a qualitative research project, is that any project you do, you have to think of how the question influences the methodology, how the methodology influences the data collection approach or the data analysis approach, how the resources available, the time you have available, the different people who are involved play into this, and you have to consider all of these answers in concert with the different elements of the project. So just a few resources. So I gave you these ones back in October. They're very helpful for understanding all this philosophical stuff. the Giacomini articles on your comprehensive exam list, and the Morse reading and the Lincoln, Linham, and Guba reading on your comprehensive exam list will also be helpful here. In terms of reading about methodologies, so on your comprehensive exam list you have a bunch of different methodology-specific readings, and those will be essential. You can also look for some introductory textbooks. So this one by Creswell is I don't know, commonly used, I guess, and it kind of gives an overview of the different methodologies, but because one person wrote it, it's very useful for comparing the differences and understanding how things vary across methodology. But really, typically, any kind of introduction to qualitative research textbook will give you some sort of example of here's a handful of methodologies and here's how they're different. Beyond just kind of getting a sense of what the different options are or how the different methodologies might differ, when you actually want to design or conduct a project, it will be really essential to consult the core text, the core methodological text of the methodology that you're interested in. So often these come in book form. There's a few methodologies where it's sort of more scattered development, where you look at different authors and different articles. And then I would say probably more commonly with most methodologies, there's like one or two core textbooks that people really rely on. So those are very helpful. I think I probably said in October, but Wikipedia is a really great resource just for getting a sense of a quick overview of the methodology, something you can scan, what type of questions, what type of data collection methods, and then where's a list of more authoritative readings that I could go for more information. So if you're at that stage where you just don't know what methodology to pick and you don't want to be reading 8 different textbooks to get a sense of what's out there, I'd recommend starting with Wikipedia to help you just get a sense of what there is and identify some methodologies to dig in more deeply. All right, that's it for video 1.